hi everybody, I'm so happy to be here tonight, and thank you so much for making it possible for me to come and visit and talk tonight about a topic that is a rather controversial one. It's an issue that affects a lot of people, and yet it's hard for many people to grasp the idea that domestic violence can happen anywhere. Many people think it just happens in certain parts of town or in certain types of economic brackets, but the fact is domestic violence happens no matter what income area you live in, no matter what career you're practicing, no matter what gender you are. It can happen to anyone, anywhere. And tonight I'm going to be talking about domestic violence in the affluent community and hopefully shedding a little bit of light on this issue. The name of my program is called Women of Means Escape Network, Silicon Valley. We say Women of Means, or WOMENSV for short. And what we do is we offer resources to women depending on what they need, personal, counseling, legal, financial, vocational, educational resources. We hook them up with different providers depending on what their needs are. And here's our mission in a few words. Our goal is we are working towards eliminating domestic violence in affluent areas through education, through trainings and presentations like the one I'm doing tonight for professional providers like yourselves, but also for the general public. The idea is to raise awareness in general about this issue. And then the second part of our mission is to provide support and education and resources for the women who are experiencing domestic violence to help empower them to deal more safely and effectively with this issue, not just for their sakes, but for their children's sakes, so that they can heal from the consequences of domestic violence that have happened to them and their children, find safer ways, more effective ways of dealing with it, and then hopefully eventually move on to create a healthier life for themselves and their children, because I'm sure you'll learn from your work with Brett that domestic violence is not just an adult issue, it's also a children's issue, since women and children are so severely impacted by living in a home where there's domestic violence. Here's our website, if you get a chance to check it out, www.womensv.org, and this is the video that talks about our program and interviews some of the ladies who've benefited from our services. We are funded by the Los Altos Community Foundation, and we go out into the community, as I said, and give presentations to the public and also to providers, to interns, to psychologists. I did a 6-hour presentation for psychologists, licensed clinical psychologists. A couple of months ago. It was sponsored by the Santa Clara County Psychological Association, and they even earned continuing education credit for it. And I was just telling Brett, I'm very pleased to announce that this conference, the Domestic Violence Conference that happens this year and every year, they've invited me to speak at that one, at the upcoming 2014 conference. So I'm very excited about that. And these are the services that we offer. We do court, police station, and attorney accompaniment with clients, and it can be sometimes very traumatic for a victim or a woman who's going through not just the trauma of dealing with a relationship that is causing a lot of issues for her, but also trying to deal with the aftermath of that if they move through the divorce process. Just seeing their abuser in court can be traumatic and make it very hard for them, and going to a lawyer for the first time, opening up that divorce process can add additional trauma to their lives. So we try to be supportive in that environment. We offer individual support. We run a helpline. We have a directory of providers that give domestic violence resources, people who are trained in domestic violence, lawyers, therapists, social service providers. And we do consults with therapists and attorneys who have clients dealing with domestic violence. Because you know that you can become a family law attorney with no training in domestic violence. And you can become, as we were saying, an MFT with only 15 hours of online training in domestic violence, which you can get, as some therapists have told me, in an afternoon. So you're so lucky to have Brett's many years of wisdom and experience to draw from when sometimes it can be gotten so easily. And PhDs, I've talked to many PhDs who have no experience in domestic violence, and yet they still were able to get their license. So the fact that you are getting information and education around this issue is very, very important. Very happy to see this. And this is just something else we do here is raising awareness about the issue through putting on events like the 1 Billion Rising event on the Valentine's Day. We invited people to come and bring a poem, a song, or a story about what healthy love looks like. And it was just a wonderful way to celebrate healthy relationships. And we even had Judge Len Edwards attend, who was the founder of the Domestic Violence Council. Very privileged to have him come. And the future president of the Santa Clara County Psych Association came as well. So very happy about that. And I just wanted to let you know a little bit about my background before I start talking about the issue tonight. And this is the latest honor that I've been very excited to receive, was from the Outstanding Community Services Award from the Santa Clara County Psychological Association. So, and we've been in Gentry Magazine. So just a few disclaimers before I start. I am a domestic violence consultant. I'm not a therapist. I'm not an attorney. I'm an educator by training. I have a master's in English literature, and I was a social worker, a social researcher did social research work at Stanford University's Center for Research and Disease Prevention. Created a program there that was designed to educate young women about eating disorders, and then went out into the school district to put it on, to teach it. Tonight I'm going to be, and I do have the state certification in domestic violence training. Tonight I'm going to be talking about one type of abuser, the affluent abuser. There are many different types, so I don't want you to think that I'm painting every abusive situation or person with the same broad brush. These are characteristics that I've noted after dealing with 180 women over the past 2.5 years. I've had 180 clients in the last 2.5 years, which kind of is an indication of the need that is out there, this unmet, until now, this unmet hidden need. And I will be changing a few key identifying details when I tell you some stories. I will be telling you some stories about my clients, but tweaking the details to protect their confidentiality. And these are experiences, stories, this is information that I've gathered through working with these 180 women. It's not data-driven research. Why? Because there isn't really a body of data-driven research around this demographic. So if that's an area that piques your interest, please pursue it. There's much more that needs to be done. So tonight we'll be talking about what it looks like in the affluent community, the specific challenges it represents, and then some resources. And it's some key points that I'd like you all to go away with tonight is that it happens, as we said, in every economic group, and the suffering is the same. It's not like, oh, people suffer more because they have more money, or people suffer more because they have less money. Pain, emotional torture is the same. It doesn't matter if you're in a one-bedroom apartment or a huge mansion. Psychological torture, physical abuse is devastating. And there are many different types of abuse, which I'm sure you'll talk about in your class, but I want to go beyond just the physical or sexual kinds of abuse to talk about the four of the most common types that I've seen in the affluent community: emotional, financial, legal, and technological abuse. Especially given that we live in Silicon Valley, you'd be amazed at what goes on. And then I'll be talking about a basic profile of what an affluent abuser looks like based on my clients' reports, and then what I've noticed about the clients themselves. And then another key point, which I'm sure you'll cover in your class, is that marriage counseling, while it can be very effective with healthy couples who have some issues or an unhealthy relationship, when there's abuse involved, marriage counseling can actually end up doing more harm than good, and is usually contraindicated, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then I want to mention some resources too. So just to start, you know, in some ways we've come a long way, baby, from the old days when we were scrubbing floors and working in these menial tasks. Now we get to smoke, yay! But here's some ways that we haven't really come so far. This is a study put out by the World Health Organization, finding that 1 in 3 women on the planet will be raped or beaten during her lifetime, and usually by someone she knows. And your experience as college students too, did you know that, I've heard that the statistic is even higher now, but that 1 in 5 college students experience some form of intimate partner violence. 1 in 4 women in the US will be beaten or raped in their lifetime by an intimate partner. The reason why I focus on women in my work is that statistically, women tend to be more often the victims of domestic violence, but that may be in part because they're more comfortable in some ways of coming forward to report it. 85 to 95, depending on the statistic you read, 85 to 95% of victims of domestic violence are female. So that's the focus of my program. But I do want to acknowledge that men can be victims of domestic violence too. And in some ways it strikes at the very core of their identity as a male. It's not supposed to happen to men. It happens at about the same rate, if not at an even higher rate, some studies have shown, in gay couples as in straight. So as I said, no person, no sexual orientation, no career, no economic bracket is immune to domestic violence. It happens across all those categories. And here it is, the leading cause of injury to women between these ages, 15 and 44 in the United States, causing more injuries than car accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. So the #1 health and safety issue affecting women. Let me just ask you a question. Do you know the statistics for breast cancer? 1 in how many women are affected by it?
8 or 9.
Yeah, I've heard 1 in 8. Do you know when Breast Cancer Awareness Month is?
October.
Aha, okay. So, and we talked about the statistics for domestic violence, like 1 in 4, like twice as many. Do you know when Domestic Violence Awareness Month is? You may already, but do you know when it is? Aha! And so many of the audiences have no idea when Domestic Violence Awareness Month is. It is October. Same month, twice the statistics, and yet we have a lot of work to do in terms of raising awareness about this issue, and it impacts so many people. And you, in your work in particular as therapists, when we think about the statistics, it's inevitable you're going to have clients dealing with this issue. So you are going to become better therapists as a result of taking your class with Dr. Johnson. You are also going to become better therapists the more reading, the more research, the more knowledge you acquire throughout your career in the area of domestic violence. You'll find that it's very hard to get the truth from your clients, at least initially, until they feel safe with you to actually reveal what's going on in their lives. And some of them may not even be able to identify it as abuse. Some women think I'm not being beaten, therefore it must not be abuse. So becoming more trauma-informed through learning more about domestic violence and the impact it has on your clients will help you become a better therapist. You've probably talked about the basic definition of domestic violence. The key words are, 2 key words are power and control, right? It's not all about physical violence. Any behaviors that intimidate, manipulate, humiliate, isolate, frighten, terrorize, coerce, threaten, blame, hurt, injure, or wound the victim or someone the victim loves, or a pet even. So these issues do not cause abuse in and of themselves. Like some women will say, oh, but he's had such a hard time at work, he got laid off, or if the drinking would stop, or the drugs, or maybe it's something I've done. And you'll probably be talking about different types of violence. Pathological violence occurs where there is an actual connection between the drug use and the violence. But there's and often when that in that particular case, pathological violence, when that drug addiction is addressed, then the violence goes away. But there are other cases where abusers drink and are violent, and they don't drink and they're violent. But that type of abuser can be more prone to becoming abusive by sort of lowering the threshold of the potential that's already there. So alcohol in and of itself, it's not fair to say that, remove the alcohol, you remove the problem. Abuse is a learned behavior. It can be unlearned, but with motivation, effort and motivation, and that's not always present. And particularly in Silicon Valley, with many of the behaviors, the controlling, I'm in charge, it's my way, I'm right, how dare you question me, a lot of these attitudes actually get rewarded in Silicon Valley. And you probably already talked about this, the cycle of violence. There's a book by Susan Weitzman called Not to People Like Us, and in it she says, there's that pattern of the feeling like you're walking on eggshells, the tension rises, the explosion, and then that sort of cooling off period, hearts and flowers, honeymoon, or I'm sorry honey, it'll never happen again, that wasn't me. according to Susan Weitzman, in more affluent communities, affluent abusers tend to skip the apologies. There's that sense of, look at the lifestyle, you know, that you get to live here with me, providing all this for you. And if you haven't talked about this already, you will, so I won't spend time on it, but it's the power, two basic, you know, the sort of the two primary things you'll be talking about is that cycle of abuse and the power and control wheel that talks about the different types of abuse. And I will be talking about some of these tonight. But then think about abuse as a way of something that isn't just this sort of isolated case at some point in a woman's life, but it can be something that spans generations, that begins on the playground. In bullying, you may see is a young child who's picking up behaviors from, you know, hanging around with the wrong peer group or some bad influences from the media that they've been getting into, but they might also be mirroring behaviors that they've seen at home, how dad treats mom or mom treats dad. So as we move forward through the lifespan, it could become teen dating violence. Moving forward, as they pick partners in college and as they get married, intimate partner violence, and carried forward long enough, it becomes elder abuse. So domestic violence is something that affects every generation. Intimate partner violence can affect anyone, no matter, you know, what age they are. And the earlier we can get to it and address it, and the more effective we can be, because it's so hard to cure an issue like this. Education is key. You know, when we're in elementary school, probably by the time we graduate, we probably know what the main export of Bolivia is. But how many of us know what the fundamentals of a healthy relationship are? And if you're not getting it at home, where are you getting it? So on to what it looks like in the affluent community. We have this general idea that domestic violence doesn't happen in the nicer parts of town, or on the rare occasion, if it does, then she should have the resources to look after it, you know, by herself. She's got money, you know, why doesn't she handle it? But that public perception is wrong. Part of it is this confirmatory bias we have, this idea of things having to fit into a certain way of looking at the world. And what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at these two people here. Which one more typically, do you think, fits the profile of an abuser? What would you say? Yes, and the hint is, what did we call it? What's he wearing?
A wife beater.
A wife beater, okay. Yes, okay. But now who knows the story of the other wife beater? Sheriff Mercarimi, who was elected sheriff in San Francisco, right, until that New Year's Eve, when there was a domestic violence incident that he was convicted of, found guilty of, against his wife, and had his badge removed and his gun taken away, and he was put on probation and forced to attend these classes. And then after 9 months, you know what happened? Got reinstated. He's now sheriff, and he is overseeing the Batterers Intervention Program. How ironic is that? Yeah. So this is a quote from Representative Lynn Woolsey, who was the representative till last year for Sonoma and Marin County. And when she started her first battered women's shelter, she found there were many nights when there were no beds left. And if you get into this line of work, I wish you luck finding shelter for your women looking for a place to stay. It's like it's impossible in the weekends, almost impossible during the week. Very, very hard. We definitely need more resources in that area. So this is that book I mentioned before, Not to People Like Us, but Susan Weitzman, who talks about it being very prevalent in educated, employed American women, crossing all economic lines, and the two hardest income brackets to escape from are the lowest, which, you know, makes sense, but which might sound counterintuitive, the highest. But the more money, the more power, the more influence you have, the more tools you have at your disposal to make it hard for your victim to get out, and the farther you have to fall. So you're going to get people representing different organizations. There's Shalom Bayit that talks about, focuses on domestic violence in Jewish families. Maitri that focuses on domestic violence in the South Asian community. The YWCA and Next Door have a special expertise dealing with the Hispanic population. They're all different sort of cultures and groups with different sets of values. And the one that's been sort of underrepresented until now has been this people that come from a part of town where, as I said, where it's not supposed to happen. They have their own sets of beliefs, traditions, challenges, stresses, values that can make it hard for them to deal with the idea that they might be a victim of domestic violence. Some of the pressures that happen in the more affluent community is the huge pressure on children to succeed academically. You must get straight A's. You must make it into that Ivy League school. You're going to be a professional when you grow up. And the idea that it doesn't happen here. Or if something is going on, we must not talk about it because image is so important. We don't fail. We don't fail in our professional life. We certainly don't fail in our private life either. So reputation, status, image, very important. And also there's that stress and the pressure put to make sure that you preserve the higher income earner's career. What happens if the police are called and he was arrested, and how is that going to impact his ability to support his family? And this notion that women often say, well, I'm a professional woman, I'm educated, I run my own business, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a professor, it can't possibly be happening to me. Or I'm not being beaten, it must not be abuse. Or they think about the things that they have. I have so many things to lose, this home, the good schools that my kids go to, I have this lifestyle. And then many of them get threatened with having everything cut off if they decide to leave. And so often this comes up, we'll visit this again as they talk about the profile of an abuser, but so often there's this language attached to once the divorce begins. I've heard, I can't tell you how many times, maybe 30 times from 30 different women, this exact phrase, their husband saying, I will destroy you. So there is a problem with money, and I know, oh boy, we should all have that problem, right? But it does often put women at a disadvantage when they don't have control over the money, when their partners take control of it. So the 4 most common forms of abuse that I'm going to be dealing with tonight, the emotional, financial, legal, and technological. These are 4 of the more common ones that I've seen and the ladies that I've been working with. So beyond that, you probably all know all you need to know about physical and sexual abuse. But emotional is more subtle, undermining her sense of self-worth, her sense of self-esteem, chipping away at her with constant criticism, threats, diminishing her abilities, calling her names, undermining her relationship with her children. But you know, when you're beaten, when you're bruised, eventually those marks will heal, right? The skin will heal. But when you have threatened somebody's very sense of identity, who they are, their ability to make it in the world, those are the scars that can last a lifetime. This is the tricky part, that it can start off so subtly, incrementally. You know that old analogy of the frog and the pot of water on the stove, you turn it up degree by degree, and before he knows it, there he is, you know, dancing around in boiling water. So it could start with just this sort of rolling of the eyes or a disapproving look, or are you sure you want to wear that dress tonight? I don't really think blue is your color. Or are you sure you're ready for that job promotion? And you really think you can handle that level of responsibility? You really think you want to abandon our family? You know, just leave the kids to their own devices while you go out, you know, and selfishly pursue your own needs. What about us? Who was that guy you were talking to at the party last night? You sure seemed to be having a good time. Yes, you did. So you can see how it sort of ramps up over time to waking her up in the middle of the night and going on these 2 or 3 hour tirades, calling her all sorts of different names, and she's still expected to get up and do her duties, go to work the next morning. And usually these forms of abuse get worse over time. An example of one of my ladies, an example of what emotional abuse looks like in the affluent community. A lady was asked by her lawyer why she didn't let him work harder to get her a fair settlement. He said, I could get you a much better deal than what you're going after. Why are you so reluctant to let me fight for you? And she said, remember, she's married to a doctor, still living with her husband, and she's going through the divorce. She said, well, you know, the other night, you know what he said to me over dinner? He said, you know, there's more than 40 ways to kill a woman and make it look like she died from natural causes. Now, he's not going to get arrested for saying that, right? That's sort of interesting cocktail party conversation, but she totally backed off, settled for much less than she was entitled to. And you think, oh, that's just like, you know, a little anecdote there. But here's another case in the paper, happened in Utah. It was an almost perfect murder. And this fellow, who was a doctor, a lawyer, and a bishop in his local church, bragged to one of his former mistresses that he could kill a woman, make it look like it was natural causes. And he ended up pressuring his wife to get plastic surgery, pumping her full of drugs that would be hard to detect in her system, and she died. But he was eventually convicted of murder. This is the picture-perfect family. Other examples of what emotional abuse looks like. Another woman moved into their beautiful 10,000 square foot house, and the first thing he did was take out the dishwasher. And he said, telling her, if you can't fix it, you shouldn't own it. So for 30 years, she did her own dishes. Another woman, they lived in a huge house. She was confined to the downstairs servant's bathroom and not allowed to have toilet paper in it. Adding sort of that humiliation to sort of that demeaning, like invading her, just sort of invading all sorts of boundaries. He was the one that would come in, barge in on her while she was using the facilities, ranting and raving at her. So just heaping all kinds of emotional abuse on her. The gun catalog. So there was a woman whose husband, she knew he was a gun enthusiast, but he'd never ordered a gun catalog before. They separate. He moves out. They're going through the financial settlement part of the divorce. And then what happens? What arrives in her mail one day? A gun catalog. Now, anybody else that will get a gun catalog in the mail, they go, oh, I didn't order that, and they throw it into the recycle bin, right? But she, knowing her husband's history, the threat, the fear, the terror that she lived under, like she said, her heart was just practically leaping out of her chest. And during the financial settlement portion of the divorce, again, settled for much less than she was entitled to. Now, he's not going to get arrested for that, but you see how subtle all these things are. Another woman, she had to graph expenses every month, and would get in, God forbid, she would spike one month because those expenses would, she would be forced to justify every expense. Another couple, this happened during the mediation part of the divorce process. She was doing fine. She was in there with her husband, the mediator, their two lawyers, and everything was going fine until they started talking about the financial settlement part of the dissolution. Now remember, this is a woman who had PTSD as a result of living for 15 years with an emotionally abusive partner. She'd gone to therapy. She'd taken her prescription medication, done some meditation. She was in pretty good shape. And then they start talking about the financial settlement part. And at that moment, he said, all I want here is clear communication. Sounds pretty innocuous, right? She got very shaky. She basically gave away the farm. Afterwards, it came out that always in the past, before he would not just emotionally but physically beat her, he would say, I wouldn't have to do this if you were capable of clear communication. So what appeared like a completely innocuous comment to the average person became a trigger for her. It's all about context. And without any evidence, who's going to believe her? Because so many women, even if they're being beaten, many of women in more affluent areas are reluctant to call the police. They don't want to bring that shame to the family. They don't want to, they're worried about the husband's income, the reputation, or what kinds of consequences there will be. So without any data, without any paper trail, without any evidence, who's going to believe her? And sometimes even with evidence, remember, those of you, I don't know if anybody's as old as I am, but sometimes even with evidence, they can't believe it. How can you hold those two opposite ideas in your head at the same time? Do you know that sort of optical illusion painting of the old crone and the beautiful young woman, and you can either see one or the other depending on how you squint and look at it? How do you hold both of those Jekyll and Hyde. Abusers thrive in secrecy, right? They thrive in secrecy and isolation. So what's the antidote? What we're doing tonight, talking about it. This whole thing about isolation, if you take a drive up into those lovely hills and you see, oh my gosh, look at the, the mansions they live in, the sprawling property. There's places up there that don't even get cell phone service. And I had a lady say to me, who lived in one of those places, do you know there's no one there to hear you scream? So what happens with a lot of these victims of domestic violence, and again, no matter what economic bracket you come from, is this being isolated, getting brainwashed, having your spirit beaten down, getting your sense of who you are stripped from you, this corrosive effect that it has on your self-esteem, your joie de vivre, your happiness, who you are, and it's that sort of pounding away at your identity that goes on over time that has this corrosive effect. And these are the same tactics that are used on prisoners of war. So is it any wonder that they end up with the same symptoms: anxiety, depression, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? Judith Herman, a psychiatrist, wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery that was about this. One of the chapters is about what happens during repeated traumatic experience, prolonged repeated traumatic experiences. You get these symptoms that are experienced by prisoners of war, hostages, and women and children in abusive situations. So more on the tactics of coercive control. There's this wonderful book by Evan Stark called Coercive Control, How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, talking about different tools, techniques they use. The show of violence, you don't have to hit a woman directly, right? I can hit the wall beside the woman, and the implication is, first the wall, watch your step, or next time it's going to be you. That story I told about the woman having to use the downstairs bathroom, having her partner come in, tower over her, yell at her, rant at her, intimidating, degrading, barring access to resources, no toilet paper, undermining her autonomy, and micromanaging, giving details, commands, criticism about every aspect of her life, and invading her personal space. So what happens over time? That power and control she had over her own life gets washed away and replaced by his. And her home, that should be a sanctuary. I hope you all feel like your home is your sanctuary. You can go and at home at the end of the day and shut out all the cares and just get a chance to recharge your batteries. There are women that's the last thing, the last place they want to go to at the end of the day, because their home, which should be their sanctuary, has turned into a cage, a trap, a prison. That's why the logo on my my literature is this gilded cage with the bird flying free. So I firmly believe that it's not just a woman's issue or children's issue or a civil rights issue. It's actually a human rights issue for every man, woman, and child to live in peace and safety and freedom in their own home. And abuse violates that on so many different levels. We have come a long way, but look, this is back in the 50s. If your husband ever finds out you're buying the wrong brand of coffee there, but see that sort of patriarchal history that infuses our culture. And the problem with emotional abuse is it often leads to physical abuse, often. And it can happen at any moment. I had a lady who, with 3 small children, who had been abused, emotionally abused by her husband for years, and she said, before the night, he knocked my glasses off, punched me. I never would have told you that he'd be capable of physical abuse. I had another lady married for 26 years, and then her husband started to beat her. Only then. Before, it had been emotional abuse. But something snapped after 26 years. At any moment, it can change from one into the other. This is Taylor Armstrong, who had to almost lose an eye before waking up to the reality that she was being abused by her husband. So emotional abuse, one type of abuse that affects women in affluent areas, and really any area, doesn't matter what your economic status is. But as I said, the more sort of tools you have, the more subtly you can perform that emotional kind of abuse. Financial abuse, the more money you have, like no matter what economic level you're living in, economic abuse can be practiced. But the more money you have, the more difficult you can make it. This article, the next few slides are going to come from this article by Angela Litwin, an attorney from the California Law Review, who talks about a form of financial abuse called coerced debt, the role of consumer credit in domestic violence. So when we think about financial abuse, we think typically about taking control of the finances, making it hard for her to get access to money, or harassing her at work, making it hard for her to get a job, or undermining her relationship with her boss, undermining her work experience. There are different ways it gets expressed. And there's a lady, her name is Carmen Dow, she's on the right there, and that's her daughter comforting her. A couple of years ago, her wealthy developer husband was being very abusive towards her. He would beat her for putting highlights in her hair or for buying a new dress. She eventually got a restraining order against him, and with the fear that he would actually end up killing her. Even with the restraining order, you know, the restraining order is as good as the respect that the restrained party has for the law. Even with the restraining order, he ended up shooting himself and his son. We often talk about how abusers will use children as a way of punishing and hurting the mother, and certainly killing a child is the most intense form of punishment and pain and torture that you can inflict on a mother. Examples of financial abuse, like putting her on an allowance, punishing her for, like Carmen Dow, for putting highlights in her hair, forcing her to turn over her paycheck, hiding assets. So I had a lady she and her husband built a house, they sold it, they took the $500,000 they made in the profit from the sale of the house, put it away in a joint bank account to be drawn on when they found the house of their dreams. Joint bank account to be drawn on when they found the house of their dreams, right? To remain untouched. Several years go by, she has not touched it. She finds the house of her dreams. She goes to look at the joint bank account, and guess how much is in it? So what do you call it? Don't look at the screen. What do you call it when an employee steals money from an employer? Ha. And what do you call it when a husband steals the life savings from the wife, or the wife steals the life savings from the husband? What do you call it?
Abuse.
Hiding assets. Yeah, I usually get silence, but thanks for the word. Okay, but yeah, we don't really have that sort of same kind of technical term, right? But isn't that a form of embezzlement? There's that trusted relationship that's been violated, when it comes to finances. Then other forms of like dragging her back to court repeatedly to deplete her financial and emotional resources over frivolous causes as a way of using the court system. We'll talk about legal abuse, threatening to take everything, leave her with nothing if she leaves. I had another lady who worked in the financial industry, and her husband worked in a philanthropic capacity. So he looked very good on paper, and he was earning a good income. They were both earning about equal. And he was also like taking on extra duties, but he stopped taking on those duties, and he took fewer and fewer duties. And she continued to work as hard and harder to make up for his decline in salary, until she ended up earning significantly more than he did. This is the same man that, while working in a philanthropic capacity and looking like a good, in quotes, Christian man, came home at night and strangled his wife. Choked is, you don't usually say choked, because you choke on a chicken bone, but strangling is what happens when you put your hands around someone's neck and squeeze. You can die for up to 2 weeks after being strangled like that. It's a huge lethality risk in a relationship, in a domestic violence relationship. She had called the police. She stopped short of filing a restraining order. There was no paperwork, no paper trail. On paper, he looked like a pillar of the community. And she ended up having to pay spousal support, because she was the higher earner, to the man who had strangled her. So this coerced death, it happens in an abusive context. It's a means of using debt to exercise abusive control. And what happens is it turns the credit card companies into unwitting colluders with the abuser. So the problem is, when you and your partner have credit cards, it's hard to tell what transactions have been made by you or your partner in an up-and-up way, or what transactions have been done in a coerced way, or a fraudulent way, or a way that you're not even aware of. So the way the law stands now is the two become one, and isn't that so romantic? As long as you love one another and respect one another. But when two parties are treated as one, it has that implicit understanding that there will be that relationship of what's called fiduciary trust between the two parties. But what happens when one party violates that trust? Sometimes there are legal remedies, sometimes there are not. If you have somebody that's frittering the money away at the racetrack, or the couple I told you about with that $500,000 in savings, it's not like he bought a car and she could say, look, here's a receipt for the car, I deserve to have the equivalent. When the money is frittered away, what's your recourse? So it can take a variety of forms, coerced debt. Taking out credit cards in their partner's name, and then running up huge debt and not paying it off. Forcing them to get loans for the abuser, or tricking them into signing a quitclaim deed if they are joint tenants on in property ownership. If they both own the house, he can force her to sign a piece of paper saying, I relinquish my part in possessing the house. I have other ladies who they were 8 months pregnant and they're about to get married, and their husband-to-be says, oh, here, sign this. This is just something my board, the paperwork that my board wants us to sign. Needs you to sign before we can get married and have our baby and live happily ever after. And when women are pregnant, it's all about the hormones, right? And they're about to get married and create a family, and oh yeah, it's a piece of paper, and sometimes documents are signed, and they can have legal implications. And sometimes women end up with very stringent, very restricted settlements as a result of these prenuptial and postnuptial agreements they've signed. So there's enough trouble starting over once you leave a relationship, trying to be safe from your partner, trying to keep your children safe, trying to get a job, but then you add to it having to dig yourself out from this kind of debt. And often what happens is they don't find out about it, full impact of the debt, until they leave. Until they try to get an apartment. What's the first thing a landlord does when you try to get an apartment? What do? They check your credit. Yes. And then what happens when they find that their credit rating, sucks? It can make it hard to get a job, hard to, get utilities installed, get going. So it creates this whole extra level of challenge for women to start over again, and it can often play into the reason why they continue to stay in an abusive relationship or end up going back, because financially it's just impossible to survive. You know how hard it is to survive financially in this valley. It will eat you alive. So coerced debt occurs often within the context of of a domestically violent relationship. In the study that this attorney Litwin did, she found that 68% reported minor domestic violence in the context of this coerced debt. So something thrown at them that could hurt, having their arm or hair twisted, being pushed or shoved, slammed against a wall, being grabbed or being slapped. 68% of them are experiencing this kind of violence in addition to the coerced debt. 41% reported even more severe incidents of domestic violence, being punched or hit with something that could hurt, being beaten up, burned, scalded, kicked. 32% reported sexual abuse. 47% reported stalking. So here's the context that it happens in, this coercive control that we talked about. And that's, this is how coerced debt can flourish in that kind of environment. So what they do is they cut off access to their partner's legal share of the finances and knowledge. Here's what they do: put them on stipends or an allowance. Don't allow them access to the family, to a joint bank account, doling out money a little bit at a time, and often requiring her to turn over any income that she gets, even an inheritance. Many women that I work with are terrified of finances now, and it's come as a result of having finances be such a trigger in the relationship of their partners refusing to share any kind of financial information with their partner, and getting very angry and abusive when that topic of finances come up. So that's part of the control there, keeping her in the dark. It puts him in that superior position. Right? If he's in control of doling the money out, he knows where the money is invested, she has no idea. I have a lady who she knows now that her husband has spread he's got 15 different bank accounts. Very difficult to track down all that information. But it puts her into that inferior position. If you think about a healthy relationship being like a teeter-totter, anybody old enough to know what a teeter-totter is? But growing up, I had such fun going up and down, up and down. And so it's this lever, right? And one person sits on one side and one on the other. And in a healthy relationship, most of the time you're sort of equally balanced, right? You share that power, you share that control. That's a healthy relationship. Every now and again, things might get out of whack, and you'll lose your temper, and you'll say sorry, and he'll forgive you, and he'll do the same thing, right? That's a healthy relationship, because we're not perfect. The ones of us who are most evolved are the ones who know that we have issues, and we're working on them, right? But in an abusive relationship where one party must always be right and the other must always be found fault with, or one party must always be in control, then you see that teeter-totter, the balance getting out of whack there, and she is in this position of supplication, of having to ask for even the most basic, her most basic needs. So here's a clue for you. If you're talking to a client and the issue of finances comes up, and she has no idea what their joint worth is, or she mentions that, oh, well, I don't have a head for numbers, so my husband, he just takes care of the income tax, and I don't know how much he made last year, because he takes care of it. He signs it, it's all done electronically now, and yeah, he gives me money. He gives me money from time to time, and that's how I get by. These are little clues, and often in an abusive relationship, the way women survive is by minimizing the damage that's being done to them. So you might hear these little clues being dropped in a very sort of almost off-the-cuff kind of way. Yeah, I don't have a head for numbers, or he says he's better at it, and well, he's a financial analyst. Makes sense that he would handle all the finances. So, but keep your radar up. Could this be a symptom of something else that's going on underneath? Because often the women themselves are not aware that this is a form of abuse. And back to this issue, why do women stay? Why do they go back? Why is it so hard to leave? Finances can be a huge reason why. All right, so we talked about the emotional abuse, we talked about financial abuse. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about technological abuse in our area in Silicon Valley. You'd be amazed. Maybe some of you already know about some of these things, but just look at some of these pictures here. This looks like a switch plate, right? A regular switch plate like you'd see in a wall, but here's the hidden camera. This looks like a little coat hook. Here's the hidden camera. This looks like something you just put your pens and pencils in, right? There is the hidden camera. So many people think, oh, well, I'll turn my iPhone off and you won't see the GPS thing. You can get a little GPS device the size of your thumb, the size of a flash drive, stick it under the car, and then know your partner's whereabouts. There's software now that I can install in your phone in 2 minutes. And let's say I'm an abuser, and I am in a relationship with Ellie. We both have iPhones, and I've installed this software on her phone. I send her a text. Ever after that, whatever text she gets or receives, I get a cloned copy of it. I can send her a spoof message. Anybody know what a spoof? I could pretend to be Ellie's mother. I could pretend to be Ellie's lawyer. I could pretend to be her best friend. And it will actually say the person's name on top. Hi honey, it's Mom. Could you click here and send me your credit card information, your bank account number, and some naked pictures? Thanks dear. I'll make you a nice cake for Christmas. So, I mean, it's amazing the technology now that makes it so hard for women to plan their escape strategically and safely, knowing their every move could be watched. You know, and of course there's the Find My Phone, and a lot of ladies have their partners pressuring them to turn on this feature so that their husbands can know where they are at any moment. So with this sophisticated technology now, I can do all these things, sending spoof messages. I can turn your camera I can turn your iPhone into a camera that I can operate remotely. I can get all of your conversations. I can get copies of them. I can look and spy on all your history, where you've been, what you've been up to, all your contacts, all your notes. I can turn your phone into a listening bug. And I can do this all in a way that is 100% completely undetectable by you. I had a lady who took her car to the police station across the bay a while ago, absolutely convinced that her car was being bugged. And the police, they typically don't do sweeps of cars anyway, but she went home with the feeling that, she said, they thought I was just some crazy lady acting paranoid. And maybe 10 or 15 years ago, you might be, better justified in thinking that way. But realizing now that we live in Silicon Valley, realizing the level of technical expertise that so many people have now, women may be perceived as being paranoid when in fact their every move is being watched or recorded. One of my ladies was being filmed in the shower and in intimate moments in the bedroom without her knowledge. It can happen anywhere. This is a smart lock. So you can put a smart lock on your house and you decide who gets to come in, when they get to come, when they have access to come or go, and whether or not you let them in at all. And that's really good for security purposes, right? But what happens if you're an abuser? You get to decide when your wife gets to come in the house, when she gets to leave. You can make it very hard. And you can get little copies that say who's coming, who's going. You can monitor exactly who's there for how long. So now, legal abuse. So we did emotional, financial, technological, and now some thoughts about legal abuse. This was from a textbook called by Karen Bellew called Silent Suffering, Understanding Domestic Violence in Affluent Communities, from the Women's Rights Law Reporter. And here she says, when a couple divorces, the legal system may become a symbolic battleground on which the male batterer continues his abuse. I've had, I think, about half a dozen cases now where ladies have talked about how their partners have choreographed events to provoke a reaction in them. And then once they're getting them, they'll get them into a situation where they'll say, I've had a dozen women while being married to you, and they were all better than you, and I never loved you, not once. I'm going to make sure that you have nothing, and you're going to be a bag lady, and the dog, I killed the dog. So this rampage that they go on, the average person over time, of course they're going to react to that, right? And once they get that emotional reaction, then they record it, and then they without that prelude, and then all that's there is that record of her reaction being very emotional, and then they use that to say, look how crazy she is. Other things like refusing to sign documents, dragging the heels when deadlines come, letting them pass. And then Lundy Bancroft, who was a domestic violence advocate, used to work with batterers until he got so frustrated with their lack of change that he went over to the other side, and he's working as a domestic violence advocate. He wrote a book called Why Does He Do That? He talks about how it's hard for women when they keep getting dragged back to court, but also when custody is sought by the abuser as a means of it can accomplish several different purposes. And according to Lundy Bancroft, there are several studies that show that abusive fathers tend to seek custody, or more custody, more often than non-abusive fathers. So that bears looking into if somebody is going after custody in such an intense way. They accomplish several different purposes in doing that. They can look good in the eyes of the court, like this is a father who wants to spend time with his children, but in many cases these are fathers who've been either abusive, negligent, or absent throughout the child's history, and all of a sudden, now that the divorce is in process, they're Disneyland dads. So they can look good in the eyes of the court, and then again, remember what we talked about, using children as a way of punishing the mother, taking custody away from her so he can get the kids, and then using it as a sort of a way of taking revenge on her, and then turning them into pawns. I have many women who talk about their children being turned against them. We talked about parental alienation in the old days, about how men in some cases were innocently having the children turned against them, and women too. But it also happens where it can be a systematic campaign on the part of either mother or father. It can happen. Both parties can be capable of doing this, but turning the children into these tools that they use to align with them against the less powerful party, and make it look like the mother is the bad guy or the one that doesn't care. I have one lady who's, while the divorce was in process, they had a 16-year-old child that you'd think would be impervious to that kind of manipulation, but they were talking about colleges, and she said she had got a much, the settlement was very unequal. She was scraping by at that, and she said to her child, "This is the school these are the schools, the colleges I could afford to send you to." The child went to the dad, and the dad said, "Well, that's obvious. Clearly, your mother doesn't love you. She doesn't care about you. She's not willing to invest in your future. I'm willing to invest in your future. These are the colleges I'm going to send you to." With comments like that chipping away over time, kids are human. Kids have this sort of natural inclination to be drawn towards what they perceive to be the more powerful party. And in the hands of somebody who can be manipulative, controlling, and somebody with a lot of money, they can be vulnerable. Sometimes women feel re-victimized when they go back to court, when they're dragged back again and again, and often it's perceived as being this he said, she said, or mutually high conflict kind of relationship. And what gets lost is that power imbalance, because in the course of a morning, when a judge has so many cases to get through, and he's got maybe 15 minutes or she has 15 minutes to spend per case, what they look for is data, documents, records. And if you don't have that history to draw on the context, you can leap to conclusions that may not be accurate because you don't have the whole story. Nicole talked about how so often she was frustrated calling the police when she was being beaten by OJ, and they would just end up coming out to the house and admiring his Heisman Trophy. And sometimes we even have cases where there is a finding of domestic violence against an abusive party, and that person, that abuser, still ends up with shared custody of the child, and that's not supposed to happen. In Family Law Code Section 3044, they say if there's been a finding of abuse, domestic violence of one partner against another partner, then it is detrimental to the best interest of the child to be in the custody of that abusive partner. So that paragraph is supposed to trump that frequent and ongoing contact of all family members paragraph in the Family Law Code section. And fortunately, in terms of remedies, now we have this wonderful lawyer called Nancy Lemon, who's she's sort of overseeing this project through Berkeley. It's called the Family Violence Appellate Project, where women are going back to court to appeal these findings when custody has been awarded to an abuser. It's a nonprofit. And then sometimes we have these misperceptions in the courtroom, like, oh, Snow White doesn't marry Godzilla, you come from this nice fancy area, you know, you're going to marry a nice fancy man, right? But so my counter to that is, all right, Snow White doesn't marry Godzilla. Snow White marries Dr. Jekyll, and then realizes he's also Mr. Hyde. So why doesn't she leave? There's so many reasons, but the more power, money, influence, control, positive public image the partner has, the more difficult it is, and the more technical savvy it is, the harder it is to leave safely without fear of being stalked, harassed, or killed. The harder it is to keep custody of your children, harder it is to get a fair settlement, and the harder it is to keep that same standard of living. Most of my women are living way, way, way below the standard of living they were before, and their partners are either at a comparable level or even doing better. So why don't they reach out for help? Why don't they leave sooner? Why do they continue to stay so often? That there's that shame, that huge social stigma in more affluent areas. It's not supposed to happen here. Oh, what if the neighbors found out? What if my family found out? There was a doctor in my support group. For 6 months she was there before she would reveal what her profession was. So ashamed was she. Then it happened to her. They say, I'm intelligent, I'm educated, I'm a professional. This can't be happening to me. And I say there are two groups of people that are vulnerable to ending up in abusive relationships. The ones who grew up in unhealthy homes, where that's kind of all they knew, and the ones who grew up in healthy homes, where they had no idea what they were getting into. So you see, anybody is vulnerable to an abusive relationship, especially when they start off so sweet and charming and sweeping you off your feet. That's the image you fall in love with, and it can make it so hard to sort of reconcile that other person that gets revealed later. They do feel this, often women in more affluent areas feel like there isn't really any structure in place to support them, that there's this feeling that they don't have the support that they need if they did want to reach out for help. And that was one of the motivations for me to create this program, to give them some place to go to get help. And then there's that terrible fear of their own physical safety. I think it was Michael Moore in his book, Dude, Where's My Country? He was asked, do you think O.J. killed his wife? And he goes, oh no, rich people don't kill people. They pay people to kill people. So Susan Weitzman in her book, Not to People Like Us, found that the more money, the higher the income was of their partners, the more they feared for their lives, knowing that they could have paid somebody to kill them. So now let's take a look at sort of some of the characteristics I've noticed from working with women. Remember, these characteristics are based on the reports of the women that I've worked with over the last 2.5 years. So some characteristics that I've noticed after working with 180 women over the last couple of years. This is based on their reports of their partners. Now, keep in mind that these are women who are coming to my support group. They're women that are calling me on a regular basis. They're women that I'm working with, getting to know over time. So they're women who often start out blaming themselves, and they're very keen on doing what's in the best interest of their child, and often willing to walk away from any issues involved in the legal settlement, even if it means hundreds of thousands of dollars for the sake of peace. So they describe their partners as being highly educated. The partners of the women that I deal with are doctors, lawyers, engineers. I'm sad to say that 4 of the partners of the 180 women I work with are therapists. So there is no profession, I keep saying that is immune to abuse. Most of my clients report that their partners are Caucasian, but I have had all races represented in both my clients and their partners. And their partners, as reported by my clients, they look very good on paper. They're often involved in philanthropic activities. They look very good in public, pillars of the community. And they are often very charming. They can sell refrigerators to Eskimos, the old saying. Sometimes they appear to be shy or self-effacing, and sometimes they're very outgoing and extroverted and the life of the party. Many of them report that their partners lie very easily, very convincingly, and they lie even when they don't need to. It's like some of them say, he lies just to keep in practice. And 99% of them, almost every client I've had, reports the same set of characteristics. And I want you to think in your minds, because you are all therapists, and you're going to be able to use language that I, as an educator, should not be using. So I'm going to talk about behaviors, but I bet you've got some labels ready to slap on these characteristics. What do you call somebody who lacks empathy, lacks remorse, doesn't do self-reflection, and seems to have this sort of moral blindness, moral immaturity, and yet they can have this sort of glib, superficial charm? You know what I'm talking about? Okay, you can say it.
Antisocial personality.
Oh, right. Okay, you said it, I didn't. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Any other word come to mind? Thank you very much. And you can say that too. But I can't. Okay, so let's talk about sort of one of our local Silicon Valley boys who made it big. Young boy makes it big as a youth. He was like he grew up in East San Jose. Didn't start off that in an affluent area. Will get teased because he came from a Sikh family, but he was like Americanized, very like a handsome, lovely-looking young man there, and brilliant. And he left school at 16 to start his own company, and made it big. Sold his last one for $300 million. The latest estimate was, I don't know what that. Latest estimates are he's worth like $340 million. Wrote a book called The Dream. Talked about finding your greater purpose in life. High, noble ambitions, right? He even created this nonprofit and donated $1 million to it to stop hate crimes. He went undercover in San Francisco and donated $35,000 to the Raphael House, which is a house in San Francisco that helps women fleeing domestic violence relationships. Gave another $10,000 to one of the ladies that was staying there. So we won't pay too much attention to the fact that these donations are represent 0.0001 of his net worth. But how nice that he donated to these philanthropic causes. And here he is hobnobbing with the hoi polloi. Good friends are shaking hands here with President Obama on Oprah Winfrey. You can watch the interview. She's all agog over how charming and successful he is. And he's single too, ladies, she tells the audience. And here he is on Charlie Rose being interviewed by him. And here he is in his penthouse apartment and high up in San Francisco overlooking the bridge. Oh, just one more thing. Domestic violence conviction. So he was actually charged with 141 counts of battery against his girlfriend, beating her that many times. Was it 100?
Yeah.
Well, we have 47 counts, but he actually hit her 117 times. And you know how we know? It was caught on camera, the video surveillance camera that was in his apartment. But unfortunately, because the police had obtained it without a warrant, it wasn't able to be used in court. He still was found guilty of domestic violence, one charge of domestic violence battery, one charge of battery, sentenced to 3 years probation, and a 50-week the batteries intervention program, and a few hours of community service. So why was the punishment so slight? Well, in part because of that, the video being ruled inadmissible evidence, but the other part of it was the victim backing off her lack of her lack of cooperation. But just think about her position. Here she is involved in a relationship with somebody who's got so much power, so much money, so much influence. She's one person against all that. But that's sort of an example to see the context, to ask you to look to dig below the surface, to see this young man, handsome, successful, brilliant, philanthropic, and an abuser. Here are some of the templates that I think I've identified that affluent abusers tend to apply to their partners, especially during a divorce. Business, war, and chess. So with the business template, this is again based on the reports of my clients, how they describe their partners. They often, in the relationship and prior to the divorce, they will often give them documents to sign or to-do lists that must be accomplished. They have this thought that first to market wins, just like with a product. So you'll find them trying to do the best they can to get to the mediator first or to a court-appointed therapist first to present their side of the story so they can work on them and get them to align with them against their partner. They are consummate salesmen, very, very good at presenting in public and in court and and often choosing attorneys that are similarly inclined. Often they don't have friends so much as minions. They have people to do their bidding. And often in the relationship where they have that sort of business mentality, their partner's performance is going to be evaluated from time to time. They're going to get a performance review, and God forbid they should not come up to snuff. They're going to get terminated. I think it was Tesla's first, Elon Musk, who created the Tesla, his first wife, who was told, okay, fix this marriage or by tomorrow or we're getting a divorce. So sort of unrealistic expectations, orders, demands, contracts, do this, perform by this date. And what happens over time is this sort of view of the partner as almost like a resource or a commodity, a product, a possession. And over time, if there's some kind of depreciation that happens and they're not as valuable as they were before, they will often get traded in for a newer model. The trophy bride, or one of my clients, married for 40 years, and then during a life-threatening illness, was left by her husband for a woman half her age. They're very good at closing the sale, at wooing, at winning, at sort of doing the love bombing is one term that's often used. Elon Musk, when he was first going out with his first wife, she was a writer, an aspiring writer. He gave her his credit card outside a bookstore one night and sent her in there and said, here, go in and buy whatever books you want. Well, that's pretty enticing. So in the beginning, there's that spell that is cast over them, getting them to buy in. But in the business world, you make your sale and then you move on. But in human relationships, once you've closed the sale and married the person, well, now the real work begins. Fairy tales have a lot to, often the real story begins after they get married, but the fairy tales often end and they lived happily ever after. Oh, really? I think I want to write another one that starts like the beautiful princess marries the handsome prince. They go off to the castle to live happily ever after, and then, ... he begins to erase his mask and reveal the ogre that lies underneath. But meanwhile, there's been a spell cast on her, and it could take her years to wake up from that spell. Often there's that sort of management or CEO mentality that's placed in the family situation. So there's a lot of orders being given. You've got to report and don't question the boss. So these are behaviors that get rewarded out in Silicon Valley world, where they've been CEOs of big companies, or they're surgeons, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they are people that are really driving our economy now, and yet they come home and they have that same sort of demeanor, and it can make it hard to have a relationship when there's that incredible power imbalance. And again, with the business template, money is the bottom line. So when you're thinking about often in the divorce process, when they're looking for seeking custody, sometimes a huge motivating factor is so they don't have to pay child support. Sometimes when they're trying to orchestrate a restraining order, make it look like she's the perpetrator, it's so they don't have to pay spousal support. So it's a very important motivation for them. And then, so we have the business template, then we have the war template. There's a book called The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and that used to be in the history section. Now you go to a lot of academic stores and you'll see it in the business section. And they have The Art of War for Managers, I want to write a book, The Art of War for Women Divorcing an Affluent Abuser, because I was thinking with so many things that affluent abusers have in common, I wonder if they're all reading from the same playbook, and I think they are. I think they're reading from The Art of War. And if women can sort of understand those tactics and be able to counter them, they'll be able to better defend themselves against them. Truth is the first casualty of war. And because abusers, no matter what economic bracket they're from, are often very good at sort of lying, presenting lies as if they're truth, that's where sort of orchestrating these false, these events that lead to improper restraining orders without because they're so adept at creating events that make it look like she is the crazy person or the guilty person or the abuser, it can make it hard for the truth to come out. I had one couple where she was tired of being strangled by her husband, said she wanted a divorce. That was a mistake. You don't tell your abuser that you want to leave, right? Yet that's the most dangerous time. You know, there's 3 of the most dangerous times are when the woman is pregnant, or when she's telling her abuser that she wants to leave, or for the first couple of years after leaving an abusive relationship. So she made the mistake in innocence of telling her abuser that she was tired of being strangled and wanted to leave. And he said, well, let's just have one more night together. Let's get drunk together one last time. And we had a great marriage. We'll have a great divorce. And she did end up getting drunk, and he ended up putting things in her drink and brought her into the bathroom. There's lots of hard edges there. They both stumbled, fell on the porcelain. They both got bruises. He took pictures of his. And then while she was still passed out from having her alcohol being drugged, called the police and said that she was this horrible drug addict who had attacked him, and look at the bruises, and ended up losing her kids. But you'd be amazed at the lengths to which abusers will go in order to punish, in order to take revenge, and in order to not to have to give their spouse, and often their children, any money. And they often embark on this propaganda campaign. And if they didn't get along very well with some of the extended family before, now they often become best friends, and they will sort of embark on this campaign of character assassination to manipulate friends and relatives over to their side. And then they sort of mount all these different attacks against their partners. Often they will demand excessive discovery. They will attack her character. They will argue every minor point, so she won't know where the next attack is coming from, and trying to really attack her on every level. One of my clients called it a scorched earth policy, like he wanted to leave nothing standing. And this is the language I hear from my clients reporting. Here's what they report to me over and over again. These are independent conversations with many different women who have all used the same quote from their partner saying, "I will destroy you. This is war. You will have nothing." And Lundy Bancroft refers to the weaponization of the children, recruiting them as spies, or brainwashing them, coercing them, or turning them into parties or pawns that align with a more powerful parent, and to turn them against the weaker one. And again, with the war analogy, is it any wonder that they develop these symptoms of prisoners of war, as we talked about before? And one of their techniques, the abusers' techniques, is this, what I call the Trojan horse technique, making it look like you want to resolve things in a peaceful way. Let's do it through mediation, so we don't have to drag it out through the courts in a legal battle. Mediation has that sort of peaceful connotation to it, and they'll often say, "I'll even pay for the mediator." It sounds like a good deal, right? And often the woman wants peace. She wants to negotiate. She wants that. And what happens is she'll often get pressured by these two parties, the mediator and her partner, into accepting a deal that's much less fair than what she's entitled to. And yet it's done under this sort of guise of peace. And the chess analogy, the idea is to isolate the opponent. So often we talked about isolation being a tactic that abusers use, but to remove all her support pieces, friends, relatives, neighbors. I have ladies whose some of their friends have been turned against her because he's done such an adept job at convincing them that she is the crazy one, that something has happened to her, that she's got to be stopped. They're very good at thinking several moves ahead, where this whole scenario of the peaceful Trojan horse technique, with really the ulterior motive being trying to get as much of the finances pushed over to his side as possible. But she hears the word peace and acts on that. And often women, when they are dealing with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, they're just they're thinking in the moment. They're responding in the moment, and it's very hard for them to sort of take a step back and to be thinking several moves ahead like their partner is able to. So that's why I think it's so important if we can sort of take that deeper view of looking beyond a few surface incidents. One event where she appears to have lost it, to look, if you can look back through the history and see what has life been like for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, not this isolated incident. So we may see with her partner the fact that he's a surgeon, or the fact that he works with Boy Scouts on the weekend, the fact that he gave $35,000 to the Raphael House, but we may not see what all underlies here. We may see the fact that she has slapped her husband, but we may not see the fact that she has been with her child, raising that child, being in effect a single mom for the last 7 years. And we may lose sight of the fact that earlier in that evening, the father took the child into a closet, beat the child, took the child into bed, and smiled evilly at the mother, provoking that slap and then forcing the child to, call 911. So it's so important to look at the whole context, not just what she did, that slap, not just what he does, serving in that philanthropic capacity or being a pillar of the community. So what is he thinking? There is that sense of entitlement. Think Henry VIII. Oh, I can't divorce. I can't get a divorce. Oh, I'm just going to create my own religion then. Or maintaining that the abuse is always her fault, and over time, if she's brainwashed long enough, she'll start to believe it. And often women tend to think that their husband's law trumps California law. And it's going to take some sort of debriefing, deprogramming to help her realize that in fact, California law, which is a community property state, trumps the husband's law. And she is entitled to 50% of those joint assets that they have both accumulated over the course of that marriage. He often believes that everything belongs to him, even her, and thinks of things in terms of possessions. And we talked about the Jekyll and Hyde. We talked about Sheriff Mercurini. It's getting harder to cover it up, especially when Casa de las Madres puts up a big billboard the next day when he says, oh, it's a private matter. No, in your face, Sheriff Mercurini. Domestic violence is never a private matter. And then victims of affluent abusers, they may be on prescription medication, and he may use that as saying, well, look, she's not capable of looking after children and she's on all these drugs, but she may be dealing with the anxiety and depression as a result of having lived with abuse for years. She may have an eating disorder because maybe food is the only thing she can control. She may not have confided in anybody because of that fear, that shame. And I had one lady, she was a vice president of a bank, and after 26 years of emotional abuse and some physical, she ended up being a clerk in another branch of that bank. And many women have recanted as a result of the fear. Sheriff Mercurini's wife was afraid of losing custody of her child, because her husband had threatened to do that. And you can see the video where she talks about that fear. So they may appear frazzled, fragmented. Remember, he may go into court with feeling like very confident and the consummate salesman. She may look frazzled. And be demonstrating all the symptoms of PTSD. She may not understand the legal process. He may have a very good grasp of it. And she, as we said, she may want peace. and agree to things that are really not in her best interest. And she may not have any record of the abuse because she's been afraid to even tell her doctor about it. And they often, because they've had to minimize the abuse in order to keep their sanity and function in the world, they often underestimate the degree of danger they're in. That's something else to keep in mind. You want to empower your clients. You want to help them reach decisions on their own. You don't want to replace one source of power with another by being so directive, saying you should do this or you've got to do this. So it's like sort of gentle, offering suggestions, presenting options, helping them develop that sense of power over their own life again, but then also being aware that their judgment could have been compromised somewhat by having to minimize those red flags, those danger signals, that woman's intuition, that feeling that something is wrong, that they're in danger. They've had to minimize and tune that out in order to survive. The symptoms of PTSD can make it hard when you're dealing with police, when they try to tell the story of what happened and they leave out important details. And sometimes police officers, if they're not trauma-informed, they can doubt the credibility of women when they're leaving out the fact that, oh, I forgot to mention he threatened to run me over with his car this afternoon. That's because it's in the context of so much other trauma that's happened to them. So they're often dissatisfied with the relationship, afraid to speak their truth, afraid of their partner. They might look competent on the outside world, but just having a very hard time keeping it together at home. So both partners often end up leading these double lives. With one face in public, she may be serving in all these volunteer capacities. She may be running her own business. She may be a professor or a lawyer out in the world. She may be a stay-at-home mom. She may have a very different identity when when the doors are closed at night. And then here he is, a possible pillar of the community on the outside, and then at home, a very different person. So it's almost like both parties are leading these double lives. There's like 4 people in the marriage, and that's too many. With all the types of abuse that I've talked about, can I just see a show of hands how many people either know somebody, let's say know somebody who's been affected or impacted by domestic violence, so forth. Every single time I ask that question, whether it's an audience of 5 or 200, 99% of the people in the room raise their hands. That's, again, why it's so important to get information, education about this issue. So then, in terms of resources, just a few. I'm not going to go over these because the lists of questions to ask or clues to look for. You have them all in the handout that I gave you, so it's just a question of sort of reading this information. And questions to ask if you suspect abuse. This again is included in your handout. Because you're not going to sit down with your client and say, "Are you being abused at home?" They're going to say yes. Often it takes a long time for them to feel safe with you, and often they don't know that they're being abused. They don't have the language to put on it, and that's part of your role, is to help educate them so they can begin to put language on it. Because how can you fight something that you can't identify? First comes the name. Ah, that's financial abuse. Oh, that's technological abuse. That's emotional abuse. And then you can figure out what to do about it. So then just a word about why marriage counseling doesn't work. If you think about counseling in general with couples counseling, it assumes honesty on both parties' part, like the relationship is uppermost in their mind, and they both want to work together to make it a healthier, happier union. But if one partner thinks it's all about fixing her, and she's the problem, and he's not willing to be honest about his role in it, if he thinks that he's above reproach, it's going to be very hard to make progress. And if she gets punished every time she tries to ask for change, says to him, "It hurts my feelings," or tries to use assertive statements, "When you call me an airhead, it hurts my feelings." In their private life, he may have called her. She may have asked for that, and he may have said to her, "Well, airhead, if you weren't such an airhead, I wouldn't have to call you an airhead. But because you are," and you see even the assertive technique there, in an unhealthy relationship or a healthy relationship with some flaws, assertiveness can help. But if it's a power and control issue, he will see that as a threat to his power, and she'll give him a verbal nudge. He'll give her a verbal knockout or physical knockout punch. So asking for change in couples therapy can be perceived as criticism, an attack that must be countered and put down by reasserting his control. One of my ladies was in family therapy, a 16-year-old daughter, the mother, and the father. And this was a man who was a total atheist and had been sexually inappropriate with the daughter, and she did not want to spend any time overnight with him as a result of that. And now in that family setting, he completely denied that, and he said to her in front of the therapist, "My dear, I've been praying about this issue, and I know in the Bible where it says this, and I hope with God's help we can heal our relationship." And she said, "Dad, you're such a fake," because this is the same father, remember, who she knew from 16 years was an atheist. And the therapist, unknowing, not knowing the context, said, "Well, it looks like your dad is really trying hard here to work and mend the relationship." So you see how honesty goes out the window when the abuse comes into play, and it can end up doing more damage than helping. So, and often the abuser is invested in the status quo, because, I mean, they want to keep that position of power. So we talked about assertive restraint. And the same with anger management. If you think about it, like sometimes abusers will get ordered into anger management. Sometimes there's an anger issue, but sometimes it's a control issue. And they can be in the middle of a tirade, and there'll be a knock at the door in the next door neighbor, and the tirade stops instantly, and it's like, "Hi, Charlie, how you doing?" Or we have an abuser in full throttle, and the woman calls the police, and he gets to the police before she does and says, "I'm so glad you're here. She's having another one of her psychotic breakdowns. Can you please help me?" So you see how he turns it off from flinging plates and knives and threatening her life, making her hysterical, to, "Oh, thank you, I'm so glad you're here." And guess who ends up being slapped into restraints and put on a 5150 because she's hysterical and claiming that her husband is trying to kill her. But he's gotten to them first and claimed that she's having another psychotic breakdown. So it's not so much an anger issue as a control issue when we're talking about abuse. This is an assessment tool that you can take yourselves to look to see if you are at risk, and you can give this to your clients as well. And then the last part of this, what I want to talk to you about is techniques, tools, things to think about as you're working with your clients. Just a basic approach to listen, to validate their experience, because so many of them think that they're crazy, or no one's heard them before, no one's really listened. So just to hold their story and to say, "I know it must have been hard for you, I acknowledge the pain that you've been living with." To empathize, that's so powerful. To help them feel safe. Stages of recovery, the first step is helping them feel safe. And then in that safe environment to sort of do that trauma narrative, and then to help reconnect them with life so that they can learn to love and trust again. So, and then we can offer them different resources. WOMENSV is one, there's many. There are counseling clinics, there are therapists that are knowledgeable about domestic violence, attorneys. I have them all in my directory, and if you look at my website you can find them. Or call me, and if you have clients and to talk about it, I'd be happy to talk with you about them. But it's important to know that that in the end it must be her choice whether to stay or go, and when, because sometimes it's safer to stay. Sometimes she's acting as a buffer between her abuser and her children, and the abuse will get worse if she leaves, particularly if he ends up with custody and she's not there at all to protect them. So he may have robbed her of her past. He may be robbing her of her present, but there's one thing an abuser can never rob her of, and with your help, he could never take her future away from her. So thank you so much. Very appreciate your attention tonight.